The courtroom fell silent. Every eye locked on Karoline Leavitt as she stood in front of Judge Frank Caprio, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This court is not a game, Mrs. Leavitt," the judge said sternly, eyebrows raised in disbelief. But Karoline didn't flinch. She tilted her head, offering a slow, chilling smile, and then dropped a folder of evidence that changed everything. Across the room, Liberty Vanguard's lead counsel shot to their feet, shouting objections. In the chaos, Judge Caprio's gavel hammered the desk. "Order," he called. But it was too late. The secrets were out. Documents, names, numbers, and a political empire had begun to unravel. And as the courtroom watched in stunned silence, a young woman labeled a fraud stood her ground, exposing a truth far more shocking than any lie. It had been an overcast morning in Providence, the kind of gray that hung low over the city like a held breath. Outside the courthouse, camera crews positioned themselves early, jostling for angles as whispers of scandal buzzed through the crowd. Inside, beneath the soft echo of footsteps on tiled floors, Karoline Leavitt walked through the courthouse doors with the quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose, or everything left to prove. At just 27 years old, she was already a political lightning rod. The youngest ever White House press secretary, a former congressional candidate, and once hailed as the future face of her party. But today, she stood not behind a podium, but before a judge. Dressed in a striking magenta blazer that stood out like defiance against the sea of grays and blacks, she carried herself with the polished poise of someone used to the public eye, though anyone looking closely could see the pressure behind her composure. She didn't arrive with an entourage, no security detail, no lawyers flanking her, just a single manila folder clutched in her hand and the weight of a nation's suspicion pressing down on her shoulders. The courtroom gallery was already half filled, some there out of curiosity, others drawn by the promise of political blood. Among them were journalists, bloggers, local activists, and even a few rival staffers who had once traded policy barbs with her in D.C. Judge Frank Caprio sat behind his bench, flipping through the morning docket. His presence always brought a measure of calm, his warmth, his humor, the sense that he saw the people in front of him, not just their cases. When he looked up and spotted her, the corner of his mouth twitched in recognition. "Well, this is not every day," he said, voice laced with both curiosity and concern. "Miss Leavitt, you're a long way from the press podium." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom, not cruel, but surprised. Karoline offered a soft smile, polite and composed, but her eyes told a different story. They scanned the room swiftly, absorbing every detail. This was no mere parking dispute, and everyone knew it. On paper, the charges were minor, a series of unpaid parking tickets dating back over a year. But nothing about this case was simple. Whispers had turned into accusations, and accusations had become headlines. Some alleged that those violations were linked to deeper financial inconsistencies, anonymous donations, suspicious wire transfers, contributions funneled through non-profit entities tied to Liberty Vanguard, a super PACs under investigation for federal election violations. Speculation exploded when she married Nicholas Riccio, a real estate mogul with long-standing political connections. Critics said she married him to obscure the origins of illicit donations. Others argued she was an unwitting pawn, dragged into a web spun by those who saw her as useful, until she became dangerous. Now, standing before Judge Caprio, Karoline knew this wasn't just about clearing a few tickets. This was her moment, her reckoning. The headlines had branded her a fraud. The internet had dissected her every word, every photo, every donation. But none of that mattered now, because here, in this courtroom, for the first time, she would speak not to spin a message, but to tell her truth. And one thing was certain. Today, Karoline Leavitt would be heard. Judge Caprio's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the start of the session. The low hum of the courtroom quieted, all eyes fixed on Karoline Leavitt as she stood tall, her composure unwavering despite the weight of the accusations. Caprio flipped through the case file with deliberate slowness, the rustle of pages a reminder that this was no ordinary case. "Looks like you've got 5 violations here," he said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of curiosity. He glanced up at Karoline, his sharp eyes assessing the details. "Mostly downtown Providence, and 2 of them were during your press briefings, if I recall correctly." The audience chuckled lightly, their tension easing for just a moment. Karoline allowed herself a brief smile, not a laugh, but a controlled, diplomatic gesture. She had been here before, on the stage of public scrutiny. "I wasn't driving those days, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "My staff borrowed the car." Caprio raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the answer. "Staff, huh? That what they call interns now?" He gave a half smile, which earned another chuckle from the gallery. But then his expression shifted, the humor fading as he turned his attention back to the case file. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her. "It's not the fines that worry me, it's the pattern. These tickets went unpaid for months. Then suddenly, poof, donations start coming into your campaign account the very same week the car's registration was cleared." A slight tension gathered in Karoline's shoulders, but she didn't flinch. "That's coincidental. I wasn't involved in the vehicle registration," she said, her tone measured and calm. Caprio paused for a moment, as if contemplating her words, before leaning forward, his gaze piercing. "I believe you," he said, his voice low but firm. "But there's more to this file than unpaid tickets, Miss Leavitt." He opened the folder with an exaggerated motion, allowing the weight of its contents to be felt by everyone in the room. The sound of pages turning was almost theatrical. "Federal inquiries," he continued, his tone growing serious. "Suspicious transactions linked to your husband's firm. Liberty Vanguard listed as a community donor. And someone signed off on a transfer to your campaign that matches a suspicious wire from a Cayman account." A murmur swept through the room as eyes darted between Karoline and the judge. There was a palpable shift in the air as the stakes of the case seemed to rise exponentially. Karoline's jaw tightened. She stood taller, but there was an unmistakable flicker of anxiety in her eyes. She glanced around the room, the reporters scribbling notes, the gallery watching with bated breath. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, but with a trace of emotion creeping in. "With respect, these allegations come from political enemies. Nothing illegal has been proven." Caprio's expression softened for just a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "But there are too many coincidences here for me to ignore. Donations tied to dubious sources, transactions linked to companies with questionable ties, and now these parking tickets. It all paints a picture, Miss Leavitt, a picture that doesn't look too clean." Karoline's hand tightened on the edge of the podium. The tension in the room seemed to hold its breath. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she said, the words now tinged with an edge of frustration. "I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. I've never hidden behind anyone. I'm here because I've been attacked by those who want to bring me down, using every scandal, every rumor they can find." Caprio studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had once made her a rising star. But today, it was shadowed by a storm of accusations, each one more damaging than the last. "You're right, Miss Leavitt," Caprio said, his voice lowering to a softer tone. "Rumors are easy to spread, but the truth, well, that's harder to bury." He paused, locking eyes with her. So let's get to the truth, shall we? With a final glance at the case file, he set it down with a definitive thud, signaling that the real interrogation was about to begin. Karoline's carefully maintained composure faltered just enough for a sliver of raw truth to slip through the courtroom's rigid atmosphere. The weight of years pressed visibly upon her shoulders as she steadied her voice and began to speak, each word resonating with the quiet power of lived hardship. "My father was a union carpenter," she said, her voice steady but heavy with unspoken memories. "He worked with his hands his whole life. He built things, houses, schools, neighborhoods. But when he got sick, the hospital bills piled up higher than the paychecks he earned. He died owing more than he made in all those years." Her eyes shifted briefly downward, a shadow crossing her face. "I was 18 when he passed. I was the oldest, the one who had to keep the family going." The courtroom held its breath as her words hung in the air. "I worked 3 jobs through college just to keep food on the table, to pay rent, to make sure my younger siblings had what they needed. I earned every vote I ever got with sweat and sleepless nights." The crowd softened. Journalists lowered pens, cameras paused in quiet capture, and even some of her fiercest critics found themselves caught in the unexpected moment of vulnerability. Karoline's voice, usually so crisp and controlled, trembled ever so slightly, betraying the depth of her struggle. "Do you know what it's like to be called a trophy wife by people who've never met you? To be told you married money, when you were the one with the ambition?" She looked out over the gallery, her gaze sweeping past the journalists, the lawyers, the curious onlookers, and even her enemies. "I married Nicholas Riccio because he believed in my vision, because for once someone saw me, not just the headlines or the rumors." She took a breath, steadying herself against the flood of emotions. "Yes, his company donated to my campaign, but I did not launder money. I have been fighting every day to clear my name from the vultures circling with their half-truths and innuendo. This isn't just politics, it's personal." The room settled into a heavy silence. The usually brisk, businesslike hum of the courtroom dimmed to a hush, as if everyone present felt the gravity of what she was revealing. Judge Caprio, a man seasoned by decades of human stories, each one unique, some tragic, some hopeful, looked on with a softened expression. His eyes, usually so sharp and assessing, held a trace of empathy now. Then, with a voice so low it seemed almost private, Karoline added, "I buried my mother last spring." She paused, the weight of the loss hanging visibly in her chest. "People said I was posting for sympathy, trying to gain favor, but I wasn't. I just missed her." Her eyes glistened with the threat of tears, but she fought them back, not wanting to appear weak, but unable to hide the pain beneath the polished exterior. The courtroom felt suspended in that moment. Time slowed, breaths held in collective respect. Caprio folded his hands on the bench, the stern lines of his face softening. The usual veneer of judicial detachment gave way to something profoundly human. He understood, perhaps more than most, that behind every legal case lay a person shaped by loss, struggle, and resilience. This was no longer just about unpaid tickets or suspicious donations. It was about a young woman fighting not only for her name, but for her dignity, for her truth, against a storm of assumptions and attacks designed to break her. For a heartbeat, the courtroom was not a place of judgment, but a space where vulnerability could be seen and honored. Caprio's voice, when it came, was gentle but firm. "Miss Leavitt, thank you for sharing that. It is easy to lose sight of the person behind the headlines. Here, your story matters as much as the evidence on that table." The room exhaled collectively, the emotional twist now firmly woven into the fabric of the trial, reminding everyone present that justice, at its best, considers the whole person, not just the charges. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully as his gaze softened but remained piercing. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing that what was coming was more than legal reasoning. It was a moment of human reflection. "Karoline," he began slowly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've seen all kinds of people come through this court. I've seen con artists break down in tears, veterans plead for mercy, teenagers lie outright to my face. But you—" He paused, searching her face. "I don't think you're lying." His eyes swept across the gallery, briefly acknowledging the reporters, the onlookers, the silent witnesses to this unfolding drama, before returning to Karoline. "This court exists to serve justice," he said, voice steady, "not to provide a stage for political theater. But here's the truth. There's a very fine line between survival and deception, and I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the truth wears different clothes depending on who's watching." He let those words hang for a moment, then lowered his voice almost to a whisper, as if confiding a personal truth. "You say you didn't know about the transfers, that you love your husband, that your campaign was clean. But what this court, and frankly, what everyone, is wondering, is whether you turned a blind eye, whether you looked the other way when things didn't look quite right." Karoline remained silent, her eyes glistening but steadfast, a defiant yet vulnerable mix. Caprio stood and began pacing slowly in front of the bench, his steps deliberate, his mind clearly running through decades of wisdom and hard-learned lessons. "I remember when I was a kid," he said, voice tinged with nostalgia. "My father told me, never trust a man who hides behind others. That's a lesson I never forgot. It's about accountability, standing up, owning your actions." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Karoline, his gaze steady and kind. "But there's another lesson. Never shame someone just because their strength makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes what looks like weakness is resilience. Sometimes what looks like guilt is just the weight of a burden too heavy to carry alone." The courtroom was silent. The usual clatter of pens and shifting feet paused in reverence to the judge's words. Caprio continued, "This case isn't just about unpaid tickets or campaign contributions. It's about the complexity of human lives, where decisions are made not just out of greed or malice, but out of fear, love, and survival." He folded his hands again, resting on the bench, and his voice softened further. "Karoline, my job is to look beyond what's easy to see, to find the balance between justice and mercy, between law and understanding." He glanced down at the files again, then back up with a small, knowing smile. "And that balance, that's never simple. It's messy, it's human." For a moment, the judge let the courtroom sit with that truth. Then he looked at Karoline with quiet resolve. "So, we keep digging. We keep asking questions, not to condemn or absolve, but to understand, because that is what justice demands." The weight of his reflection settled over the room, setting the stage for the next chapter of the trial, one where law, life, and compassion would collide in ways that challenged everyone present to look deeper. Just as the courtroom seemed to settle into a rhythm of reflection, the heavy wooden door at the back swung open with a quiet authority. All eyes turned as a man in a crisp gray suit stepped forward, his posture tense but purposeful. The courtroom murmured. This was James Harrington, a former financial analyst at Liberty Vanguard, whose name had barely been whispered until now. Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly, the years of courtroom experience sharpening his instincts. "And you are?" he asked, voice calm but firm. "I'm James Harrington," the man replied, pulling a small USB drive from his jacket pocket and holding it up for all to see. I have evidence, Your Honor. Internal memos, account transfers, documentation proving that Karoline Leavitt did not authorize the money transfers under scrutiny. It was Nicholas Riccio who orchestrated the entire scheme. A ripple of gasps and murmurs swept through the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward, eager to catch every word, while the legal teams exchanged glances, the atmosphere charged with sudden electricity. Judge Caprio gestured to a bailiff. "Secure that drive, make sure it's preserved and logged properly." Harrington took a deep breath and continued. The money was funneled through a fake nonprofit, created specifically to disguise the transactions. The transfers happened while Karoline was overseas on official business. She had no access to the accounts. This was a deliberate setup. He paused, eyes locking onto Karoline's, who sat frozen but alert. "She's a scapegoat, Your Honor," Harrington said, his voice edged with frustration and regret. Nicholas Riccio feared a federal investigation. To protect himself, he arranged for Karoline to be the public face of the scandal. When she started asking questions, pushing for answers, he cut her off, blocked her access, kept her in the dark. Karoline's hand flew to her mouth, disbelief and relief mingling in her eyes. He told me everything was fine," she whispered, voice trembling. Judge Caprio shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of sorrow and stern resolve. "My dear, I don't think anything about this was fine." The courtroom was electrified. The narrative had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a straightforward case of unpaid tickets and suspicious donations was now unraveling into a story of betrayal and manipulation at the highest levels. Caprio's gaze swept the room, the weight of new evidence settling over everyone like a thick fog. He sat back down, steepling his fingers as he prepared for the next phase of this complex, human drama, one where truth was no longer a matter of speculation, but a puzzle waiting to be pieced together. The turning point had arrived, and with it, a renewed hope that justice might finally shine through the shadows. Judge Frank Caprio looked directly at Karoline, his eyes softening with genuine compassion. The courtroom, which had been tense moments before, seemed to breathe a little easier in the wake of his gentle tone. "You were used," he said quietly, carefully choosing his words, as if weighing them in his hand before offering them to her. "Not because you were naive. No, Karoline, that would be too simple. You were used because you believed, because you trusted too much in the people around you. And that's not a crime." He paused, letting the weight of the truth settle into the room. "But it is a lesson, one of the hardest and sometimes the most painful we learn in life." Karoline's eyes glistened as a small tremor passed through her frame. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent, every person present feeling the gravity of the moment. Judge Caprio's voice softened even further, the edge of judgment replaced by understanding. "You put your faith in people who did not deserve it, and because of that, you faced consequences that weren't yours to carry. But the law, and I, recognize the difference between those who intentionally break the rules and those who are broken by circumstance." Turning toward the court clerk, Caprio gave a decisive nod. "Dismiss the fines. They are no longer necessary." The clerk's pen scratched across the paper, making the decision official. Then, Caprio continued, "And forward this drive, the evidence of what happened, to the Federal Bureau. Let the right people investigate further." Karoline blinked, her breathing catching slightly. A part of her hadn't dared to hope for this outcome. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caprio smiled, not the stern smile of authority, but one of reassurance. He leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You deserve a clean name. But more than that, you owe it to yourself to rebuild with your eyes wide open this time." He looked around the courtroom, as if addressing everyone there. Sometimes strength isn't just about holding your ground or fighting every battle. Sometimes strength is knowing when to walk away from the wrong one. Tears slipped quietly down Karoline's cheeks. She nodded, the burden she'd carried for months beginning to lift. "I understand," she said softly. "I really do. Thank you." Caprio's gaze softened further, warmth radiating from him like a quiet beacon of hope. "Go live honest, Karoline. The world needs more of that, more honesty, more courage, more people willing to face their past and move forward with integrity." The courtroom, usually a place of conflict and confrontation, felt transformed. Karoline's shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. Around her, murmurs of approval and empathy rippled quietly among the audience. As she stood to leave, Judge Caprio offered one last piece of advice, almost like a blessing. "Remember, every day is a chance to choose a new path, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is start over." Karoline paused, looking back one last time. "I won't forget." The judge nodded, his expression steady and kind. "Neither will I." Outside the courtroom, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the steps. Karoline stepped out, breathing deeply, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs as if it were a new beginning. Behind her, the courtroom door closed gently, leaving behind a story not of guilt and punishment, but of empathy, understanding, and the possibility of redemption. As Karoline stepped out of the courthouse, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy city sidewalk. Reporters, cameras flashing, microphones extended, surged forward like a tidal wave of questions and demands for a statement. But for once, Karoline didn't stop. She walked steadily, her gaze fixed ahead, as if each step carried her further away from the darkness she had endured and closer to a future she dared to hope for. Her shoulders were still heavy with the weight of everything she'd been through, but there was something new beneath that weight, a quiet resolve, an ember of strength rekindled by the day's unexpected mercy. Behind her, the court clerk meticulously closed the case file. It was more than just paperwork. It was a record of a story rewritten. The fines that had once threatened to crush her were wiped clean, and the investigation that had begun as a desperate hope was now moving forward with official weight. James Harrington, the man whose recklessness had nearly destroyed her, was set to testify before a grand jury. His arrogance and deceit would no longer be hidden behind the walls of Liberty Vanguard. The company's shadowy operations were officially under scrutiny by federal authorities. The courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy now, not the anxiety of the accused, but the anticipation of justice in its truest form. Across the country, somewhere far from the cold marble of this courtroom, young women watched the news unfold. They didn't see just a legal proceeding or another headline about corruption and deceit. They saw a human being who stood in the fire and didn't burn. A woman who, despite being used and betrayed, found the courage to reclaim her story. For many of those young women, Karoline became more than a name. She became a symbol of resilience and the power of truth. She showed them that falling victim was not the end of the story, and that sometimes the hardest battles are won not with fists, but with integrity and perseverance. Justice, as Judge Caprio had always believed, isn't about punishment or retribution. It's about understanding. Understanding the complexities of human failings, the reasons behind mistakes, and the courage it takes to confront those truths. In the end, it wasn't the judge's gavel that freed Karoline Leavitt. It wasn't the dismissal of fines or the official investigation that brought her peace. It was the truth, raw, undeniable, and powerful. That truth cleared her name, but more importantly, it cleared the path for her to live honestly, without the weight of blame she never deserved. Judge Caprio once said, "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about understanding." And today, the world understood just a little more. The camera lenses zoomed in one last time on the courthouse steps, now empty but echoing with the silent promise of fairness and compassion. Somewhere deep inside that courthouse, a man who had long been more judge than human had done what few could. He had seen beyond the surface, past the brokenness, and into the heart of what it means to be truly just. And as Karoline disappeared into the city's hustle, a new chapter began. Not just for her, but for anyone who ever felt powerless against the tide of injustice. This story wasn't just about one woman's redemption. It was a reminder that in a world so quick to judge, sometimes the greatest strength lies in empathy. The world needed more of that, more truth, more understanding, more justice that heals rather than punishes. And for today, at least, it had found it. If this story moved you, if you believe in justice, empathy, and standing for what's right, leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? What would you have done in Karoline's place? And don't forget to subscribe, because every week, the courtroom becomes a place where truth fights power, and ordinary people remind us what courage really looks like. This isn't just court, it's life, one case at a time. Until next time, stay honest.